March 27, 1944, 0640 hours, near Salerno, Italy. Cold air clung to the lower slopes of the Italian hills as dawn struggled through a layer of gray cloud. The ground was damp from night rain, boots sinking slightly into churned earth marked by weeks of fighting. Somewhere beyond the olive trees, German machine guns coughed in short, controlled bursts, testing the silence. This was not a rumor, not a legend, not a myth built after the fact. This was a documented moment of the Second World War, unfolding minute by minute, with men whose lives were balanced on instinct and resolve. What you are about to hear is the true account of a man who did not behave as war expected him to behave. A man whose calm defiance unsettled his enemies more than any weapon. As this story unfolds, leave a comment with what surprises you most, because this is not a story that follows normal rules. And before we continue deeper into this moment, if you want more real, immersive war histories told exactly as they happened, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. At 0640, Captain John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill of the British Army lay prone behind a low stone wall, his breathing slow and measured. The sounds of battle were familiar to him by now. The sharp crack of rifle, the metallic rattle of submachine guns, the distant thump of artillery adjusting its range. What was not familiar, what never became normal, was the weight of the longbow resting beside him, the medieval weapon carefully wrapped against moisture. Across his back hung a Scottish broadsword, and somewhere behind the lines, a set of bagpipes waited for a moment that would never come this morning. The German patrol advanced cautiously, infantry only, no armored vehicle, no tanks. The terrain was too narrow, too broken. The engagement here was meant to be fast, surgical. Churchill's small unit had been ordered to delay the advance, then withdraw under pressure. The objective was time, nothing more. Visibility was limited to a few dozen meters. The hills created blind angle, dead ground where death could appear without warning. Churchill signaled with 2 fingers. His men shifted, weapons tightening into shoulders. A German soldier stepped into the open. The arrow flew before the shot. It struck with a sound that no battlefield had heard in centuries, a dull, organic impact that dropped the man instantly. Shock rippled through the patrol. Shouts followed. Rifles came up. Fire erupted. Churchill rose, sword drawn, moving not recklessly but decisively. His presence was commanding, almost surreal. Amid automatic fire and shouted orders, he advanced just enough to draw attention, buying seconds for his men to disengage. This was not bravado. This was calculation. He understood momentum. He understood fear. The withdrawal began, but the German response was faster than anticipated. Additional infantry poured in from the flank. The terrain betrayed the British unit. A narrow ravine became a trap. Machine gun fire pinned them down. Artillery was too distant to call in. Air support was unavailable. Minutes passed. Ammunition thinned. Smoke clung low, stinging eyes, clogging lungs. Churchill remained upright longer than any man should have, directing movement, covering retreats, his calm unnerving even his own soldier. Then, the encirclement closed. At approximately 07 to 15 hours, with no viable avenue of escape left, Churchill ordered the remaining men to break in small groups. He stayed behind, alone, to draw fire. It worked, but only briefly. A German squad rushed his position from the rear. When the firing stopped, Churchill stood surrounded, sword lowered. No panic, no resistance. Just a faint smile that confused the soldiers pointing rifles at his chest. They took his weapons carefully, unsure what they were dealing with. The bow drew stares, the sword, disbelief. One German officer stepped closer, studying the man as if he were an unsolved problem. Churchill met his gaze without hostility. He was searched, disarmed, and marched downhill under guard. His posture never slumped, his expression never changed. The Germans spoke among themselves in low voices, words like strange and unpredictable, surfacing more than once. By 0830 hours, he was loaded onto a transport with other prisoners. Engines started. The hills receded. For most men, capture meant waiting, surviving, enduring. For Jack Churchill, it meant something else entirely. As the truck moved north toward the prisoner of war system, he was already calculating distances, terrain, guard behavior, and timing. Not days ahead, but minutes. And before the sun reached its highest point, the first escape attempt would already be forming in his mind. The truck rattled along a narrow road at 09:10 hours, the engine's vibration traveling through the wooden benches into the prisoner's bone. Dust rose behind the convoy, hanging in the air like a fading trail of evidence. German guards sat rigid, rifles angled downward but fingers close to triggers. No one spoke. Silence, in transport, was its own form of control. Churchill counted turns without moving his lips. Left bend, uphill, short straight. He memorized time between gear shifts, listened to the engine strain, noted when the vehicle slowed near villages. His hands were bound, but his mind was free and alert. Capture had not altered his intent. It had only changed the terrain. By early afternoon, March 27, 1944, 13:20 hours, the convoy arrived at a temporary holding facility near Bari, Italy. Barbed wire coils glinted under a pale sun. Watchtowers stood at calculated distances, fields of fire overlapping. Infantry guards only, no armored support, no heavy weapons. This was a processing point, not a fortress. Prisoners were counted, searched again, and pushed through a gate that clanged shut with finality meant to crush hope. Churchill studied everything: the height of the fence, the spacing of posts, the rhythm of guards pacing the perimeter. He noticed something else too: complacency. These men were used to broken prisoners, men who waited. He did not wait. At 17:45 hours, during the confusion of evening rations, Churchill slipped away from the main group. He moved with the certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. He timed his steps to coincide with shouted orders and clattering metal trays. When a guard turned to address a complaint, Churchill was already at the fence. He climbed fast, not elegant, not careful, fast. Wire tore his uniform. Metal bit into his palms. A shout erupted behind him. A rifle cracked. The shot missed. He dropped on the far side and ran. For 12 minutes, he was free. The ground beyond the camp was uneven, scrub-covered, broken by low stone walls and irrigation ditches. Churchill ran without hesitation, ignoring pain, breath burning in his chest. He angled downhill, away from road, away from predictable routes. But speed betrayed him. A patrol vehicle intercepted from the south. Another cut him off from the east. At 18:02 hours, he was tackled, forced face down into the dirt, boots pressing into his back. No blows followed, just restraint, just silence. The guards were tense now, their earlier indifference replaced with something closer to unease. Back inside the wire, Churchill stood upright again, dirt on his face, uniform torn, eyes bright. A German officer confronted him directly this time. The words were sharp, clipped, demanding explanations that never came. Churchill said nothing beyond his name and rank. The officer stared at him longer than necessary. Later that night, at 22:10 hours, orders came down. Churchill was to be transferred north, deeper into the Reich's prisoner system. He was classified not as dangerous, but as unpredictable. That label mattered. The journey took days. Trains replaced trucks. Italy gave way to Austria, then Germany. Guards changed. Accents shifted. The air grew colder. At every stop, Churchill recalculated distances, directions, the position of the sun when visible through slatted wood. By April 6, 1944, 14:30 hours, he arrived at Sachsenhausen prisoner of war camp near Oranienburg, Germany. This was no temporary facility. Concrete. Guard towers, dogs, searchlights. Escape here was not expected. It was discouraged to the point of absurdity. Churchill absorbed the reality without visible reaction. He was placed among officers. Conditions were harsh but controlled. Food was minimal. Movement was regulated. Days blurred together for most men. For Churchill, days were units of preparation. He mapped the camp in his head by sound and shadow. He watched guard changes. He listened for trains. He noted which fences carried current and which did not. He waited for nothing. He waited for alignment. That alignment came sooner than anyone anticipated. On the night of April 4, 1944, at approximately 23:50 hours, under cloud cover thick enough to smother moonlight, Churchill and another officer slipped into a maintenance area during a routine movement. No alarms, no shouts, just two figures moving where they should not be. They reached the outer perimeter as a searchlight swept past, missing them by meters. Wire cutters worked in silence. The fence gave way. This time, there were no shots. By 00:07 hours on April 5, 1944, Jack Churchill was outside the camp, alone again, standing in open ground with nothing but the clothes on his back and a direction fixed firmly in his mind. South, toward the Alps, toward Allied lines, toward a distance measured not in hope, but in miles. And with his first steps into the darkness, the longest walk of his life began. April 5, 1944, 12 hours, outskirts of Oranienburg, Germany. The night air was sharp, carrying the smell of wet soil and distant smoke. Churchill moved immediately, not running, not hesitating, but walking with purpose. Running invited pursuit, walking invited invisibility. Behind him, Sachsenhausen remained silent, unaware that one of its prisoners was already dissolving into the countryside. He followed tree lines, drainage paths, and shallow depressions in the land, avoiding roads entirely. The sky offered no moon, only a blanket of cloud that pressed low, muting sound. Each step was calculated, each pause intentional. He understood that the first hours mattered more than the distance itself. Escape was not about speed, it was about surviving the search window. By 02:30 hours, he had covered several kilometers. His boots were inadequate, soles worn thin from captivity. Cold seeped upward with every step. Hunger was present, but irrelevant. Fatigue was acknowledged and ignored. He crossed a shallow stream, boots filling with icy water, then continued without stopping. Wet feet were preferable to being found. As dawn approached, April 5, 05 to 10 hours, Churchill reached a wooded rise overlooking farmland. He stopped there, not from exhaustion, but from discipline. Daylight changed everything. He concealed himself beneath fallen branches and leaf litter, controlling his breathing as the world brightened. German activity increased with the sun. Vehicles moved along distant roads. Farmers emerged cautiously. At 07 hours, a patrol passed within a few hundred meters. Churchill remained motionless, heart steady, mind focused. Fear existed, but it was contained, compressed into clarity. He slept in fragments, waking at every unfamiliar sound. By afternoon, clouds returned, bringing light rain that blurred tracks and softened ground. This was an advantage. At 1840 hours, as dusk settled again, Churchill resumed movement. He headed south, navigating by instinct and brief glimpses of terrain. He avoided villages, skirting their edges only when necessary. When forced to cross open ground, he did so quickly, low, timing movement with wind and rain. Days passed in this rhythm. April 7, 1944, 21 to 15 hours, somewhere south of Leipzig. Churchill's pace slowed, not from doubt, but from depletion. His body was burning reserves faster than they could be replaced. He scavenged when possible, raw potatoes from a field, water from ditches, once even a discarded crust of bread near a roadside. He ate without stopping, without ceremony. The psychological weight pressed harder than the physical. Isolation distorted time. Every sound could be a threat. Every shadow demanded evaluation. Yet through it all, Churchill maintained an internal order. Each mile was progress. Each step was resistance. On April 10, 1944, at approximately 16 hours, he encountered his first direct civilian contact. An elderly man working a small plot froze when he saw Churchill emerge from the trees, bearded, uniform tattered, eyes alert. Neither spoke at first. Churchill made no threat. He gestured south. The man hesitated, then nodded once. He handed Churchill a piece of bread and pointed toward a footpath leading away from the road. No words were exchanged. Trust was brief, fragile, but real. That night, strength returned just enough. By April 13th, the land began to change. Hills grew steeper, the air colder. The Alps were approaching. This was the most dangerous phase. German security tightened near the mountain. Patrols were heavier. Movement corridors narrowed. April 15, 1944, 04 for 30 hours. Foothills of the Alps, southern Germany. Churchill climbed through dense forest, legs trembling, lungs burning in the thin air. Snow lingered in shaded pockets. His hands were cracked, bleeding slightly from cold and effort. He had lost count of the exact distance traveled, but he knew it exceeded 100 miles. The number did not matter. The direction did. At 11:20 hours, he heard voices ahead, not German. The cadence was wrong, the tone unfamiliar. He dropped instantly, crawling forward until he could see uniforms through the trees. American. He did not rush forward. He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, stepping into view only when fully visible. The soldiers reacted instantly, rifles snapping up, commands shouted. Churchill stopped, calm, obedient. "I'm British," he said simply. At 11:23 hours, April 15, 1944, Jack Churchill's escape ended. Not in capture, but in contact with Allied forces. The soldiers stared at him, trying to reconcile the figure before them with the explanation offered. An officer approached, asking questions, checking insignia, verifying identity. When the truth became clear, disbelief turned to something else: respect. Churchill was given water. Food followed. A blanket. He accepted them quietly, exhaustion finally asserting itself. As he sat there, wrapped in Allied cloth, the reality of what he had done began to settle around him. Not as pride, but as confirmation. He had walked out of captivity, and yet, even now, the war was not finished with him. April 15, 1944, 12:10 hours, Allied forward position near the Brenner Pass, Italy. The mountain air was thin and sharp, carrying the distant echo of artillery rolling through valleys far below. Churchill sat on a wooden crate inside a makeshift command post, steam rising faintly from his damp clothing as his body adjusted to warmth for the first time in days. Medics worked methodically, checking his feet, his hands, the shallow cuts along his legs. He answered questions without embellishment, his voice steady, almost detached. Officers gathered nearby, exchanging glances as reports were cross-checked. The distance he had covered was recalculated again and again. Maps were unfolded. Fingers traced his route southward across borders and terrain that most men crossed only in vehicle. No one argued the facts. They simply struggled to absorb them. At 13:40 hours, a British liaison officer arrived. When he recognized the name on the report, he paused, then looked up at Churchill with a slow shake of the head. There was no reprimand, no dramatic reunion, just quiet acknowledgement that this man did not fit within standard expectations of captivity or obedience. By evening, April 15, 19:30 hours, Churchill was transported to a rear area facility for debriefing. The ride was short but jarring, mountain roads twisting through darkness. He watched the sky, calculating unconsciously, habits refusing to fade. Freedom, he knew, could never be taken for granted. The debriefing was thorough. Times, locations, guard strength, camp layout, transport routes. Churchill provided everything with precision. When asked why he escaped alone instead of waiting for a larger effort, he offered no philosophy, no speech. He simply said that the opportunity had existed, and he had taken it. His superiors took notes. On April 18, 1944, at 09:00 hours, orders arrived. Churchill was officially returned to active status. His escape, though extraordinary, did not remove him from the war. If anything, it reinforced where he belonged. He was reassigned for potential operations in Southeast Asia, where Allied forces were preparing for renewed jungle campaigns. For a brief moment, it seemed the story might slow, that his ordeal had reached a natural pause. It did not. At 14:20 hours the same day, news filtered through command channels that German forces in Europe were collapsing unevenly, fronts shifting daily. Churchill listened without comment. He was already restless. Captivity had not diminished his appetite for movement. If anything, it had sharpened it. He returned to training almost immediately. Physical conditioning resumed despite lingering injury. Long marches, weapons drills, situational exercises. He adapted without complaint. Others noticed that his calm under pressure had deepened, as though prolonged isolation had stripped away hesitation entirely. Among officers, his name circulated again, not as a curiosity but as a benchmark, someone who had endured the most controlled environment of the enemy and rejected it outright. By late April, discussions of redeployment intensified. Churchill was informed that he might soon be sent east, far from the European theater. The irony was not lost on him. He had walked out of Germany only to be sent halfway around the world. On April 30, 1944, at 22 hours, he stood alone outside his quarters, looking toward the dark outline of the mountains. The same terrain that had tested him now lay quiet, indifferent. He did not romanticize it. He understood it. Terrain was never an enemy. Only circumstance was. What remained, after the escape, was not triumph, but resolve. The knowledge that rules could be bent, that systems could be outpaced by will and clarity, that unpredictability, once mastered, became a weapon of its own. And though the war would soon pull him far from these mountains, the reputation forged during those weeks of captivity and flight would follow him, unsettling allies and enemies alike. Because for Jack Churchill, The experience had confirmed something undeniable. Capture was never an ending. It was merely another condition to be overcome. May 7, 1944, 06:30 hours, Allied staging area, southern Italy. Morning light spread slowly across the encampment, revealing rows of tents, stacked crates of ammunition, and soldiers already moving with practiced efficiency. The war did not pause to acknowledge extraordinary individuals. It advanced, indifferent, and relentless. Churchill walked through the camp with a steady gait, his body still marked by weeks of deprivation, yet his posture unchanged. Escape had not made him exceptional in his own eyes. It had simply returned him to where he believed he belonged. Reports of his actions traveled faster than official paperwork. Among British and American units alike, his name surfaced in conversations spoken half in disbelief, half in admiration. The story sounded implausible even to seasoned veterans. A captured officer, armed with archaic weapons, escaping one of the Reich's most secure prisoner systems, then walking more than 150 miles through enemy territory. Yet every detail had been verified. Maps confirmed it. Timelines aligned. Witnesses corroborated it. At 09:15 hours, Churchill received formal notice of reassignment. The European theater was approaching its decisive phase, but his destination lay elsewhere. Allied command required officers with unconventional thinking for operations against Japanese forces in Burma. The terrain would be different, jungles instead of mountains, but the demands would be familiar: endurance, improvisation, and the ability to operate when plans collapsed. As he packed his limited belongings, there was no ceremony, no farewell speech, only preparation. He checked equipment methodically, discarding anything unnecessary. Excess, he had learned, was a liability. By June 1944, Churchill was en route east. The world shifted again. Climates, languages, enemies. But his internal compass remained unchanged. In Burma, he would once more lead men through terrain that punished hesitation. Once more, he would ignore convention when it interfered with results. Yet it was the events of captivity and escape that would define how he was remembered. German officers who had handled him left written remarks behind. Words like unstable and unpredictable appeared repeatedly in records. They had not meant reckless. They had meant impossible to contain. A man who refused to internalize captivity as a final state. A man whose psychological posture denied the authority of fences and orders alike. Years later, when the war ended and records were reviewed, historians struggled to categorize Jack Churchill. He did not fit the mold of heroism built on medals alone. His greatest achievement involved no battlefield victory, no enemy force defeated. It involved movement, persistence, refusal. What makes this moment endure is not the distance walked, though it was extreme. It is not the escape itself, though it was audacious. It is the mindset revealed in those hours and days. A man surrounded by a system designed to erase initiative, choosing instead to act as if freedom were already his. On March 27, 1944, when German soldiers closed in around him, they believed the encounter had ended. In military terms, it had, but in human terms, it had only begun. Because captivity assumes compliance, and Jack Churchill never complied. He treated war not as a script to be followed, but as a landscape to be navigated. When walls appeared, he measured them. When fences rose, he studied their weaknesses. When orders limited him, he examined the intent behind them and discarded the rest. His walk to freedom was not fueled by desperation, but by certainty. Certainty that action, even imperfect, was superior to waiting. That motion itself could become strategy. When asked later about the experience, he never framed it as extraordinary. He spoke of it as inevitable, as though escape were simply the next logical step, and perhaps that is why his story endures. Not because he defied the Germans, but because he refused to surrender his sense of agency, even when surrounded, unarmed, and outnumbered. In a war defined by overwhelming machinery and mass movement, one man proved that unpredictability could still shift outcomes. One decision, one direction, one long walk toward freedom. And when he finally stepped into Allied hands, smiling faintly, it was not relief on his face, it was confirmation.